I'm here today with Kristin Dumais. Kristin is a professor of history and gender studies at Calvin University. She holds a PhD from the University of Notre Dame, and her research focuses on the intersection of gender, religion, and politics. She's written for the Washington Post, Religion News Service, Christianity Today, Christian Century, and Religion and Politics, and has been interviewed on NPR, CTV, the CBC, by CNN, New York Times, The Economist, The Christian Post, PBS NewsHour, and the Associated Press, as well as many international outlets that she was just telling me about. So she's getting a lot of great coverage here this year. She blogs at Patheos's Anxious Bench. And her most recent book is Jesus and John Wayne, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. So we're going to talk about that in a little bit when we get to it. But in any event, Kristin, it's really great to have you join us here today.
Oh, thank you. It's really good to be with you.
So why don't you just let us know what life is like for you? We're taping this on the last day of September, and school's in session. So how's that looking?
Yeah, so I'm in West Michigan, and for us, that looks like my 3 kids are actually back in school, which is wondrous. We did not flourish with the whole homeschooling situation at all. And so isolation, which we took really quite seriously as a family, ended up, kind of taking its toll on us. And so it is wonderful to have the kids back. And so far, so good. Lots of strict monitoring and quarantining of anybody necessary. So that's working. I'm also back in the classroom myself. I teach at Calvin University, and we are back to face-to-face teaching and also simultaneous remote, which seemed utterly overwhelming to anticipate, but it's going fairly well. And here too, our COVID cases are very low on campus, and we have very strict monitoring and quarantining. And if a student has any exposure or even a sniffly nose, they are out of the classroom and they tune in remote, and it works quite well. So we're holding on, week by week. And apart from that, I've just been doing a lot of remote conversations and interviews and connecting with people all around the world.
Well, it's really good to hear that it's gone so well. This is kind of a challenging time where colleges have started up and elementary schools and everything else, and churches really too at one level. So it's really been occupying folks pretty heavily.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad that that's all going well. So I mentioned your book, Jesus and John Wayne, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. So first, maybe you can tell us a little bit about how you came to write that book.
Yeah, this book, the research for this book actually goes back more than 15 years. So I was teaching at my university and actually teaching a little unit on Teddy Roosevelt, and a couple of students came up to me after class and said, Professor Dumais, there's this book that you really need to read, because I've been showing how Roosevelt's ideas of masculinity were connected to religion and nation and war and empire, and very militant. And the book they handed me was John Eldridge's Wild at Heart, Discovering the Secret of a Man's Soul. And this was a book on Christian masculinity that was hugely popular in the early 2000s, would sell more than 4 million copies. And all the guys in their dorms were reading it, church small groups. And that book opens with a quote from Teddy Roosevelt. And it presents a very militant, muscular Christian manhood. And this was right at the time of the Iraq War, when we had all the survey data that white evangelicals were disproportionately supportive of that war, of preemptive war in general, condoning the use of torture. And so as a historian of gender and religion, I decided, just like I had done in the case of in the classroom around Teddy Roosevelt, asked how ideas of gender, of Christian masculinity, might be connected to broader issues of the American nation and the American military. So I set the book aside for a time. Actually, I researched it for about a year, set it aside in part because I first was incredibly disturbed by what I was finding. And related to that, it wasn't clear to me if this was some sort of a fringe movement or if it was really closer to the center of American Christianity. And as a person of faith myself, I wasn't sure that I wanted to be shining this bright light on the dark underbelly of American Christianity. And frankly, that instinct now, it might sound quite noble, but it troubles me. that I was participating in kind of this brand protection and not following the truth where it was leading me. But I did set it aside. I noticed in ensuing years how many of the men I had been researching who were promulgating this militant masculinity became implicated one after another in sexual abuse scandals or in abusive power situations. And then in the fall of 2016, we saw white evangelicals supporting Trump, even in the aftermath of the Access Hollywood tape release. And all of a sudden it clicked for me. I'd seen this before. I'd seen white evangelicals rally behind abusers and abusers of power. And rather than seeing this as a betrayal of evangelical values, I wanted to explore how it was actually in many ways consistent with their embrace of this militant conception of Christian manhood. And that's when I decided to write this book.
Wow. Well, and it's an amazing book in that, you unveil a lot of ugliness.
It was a hard book to write for that reason, right? It was a lot of difficult material, particularly the chapter on sexual abuse within evangelicalism. But other chapters were actually quite cathartic to write. I've lived and breathed this culture for much of my life, and I've seen it. And to be able to just put it into words and then kind of hold it up for examination, it was cathartic, and it felt empowering to be able to do so.
Well, let's talk about the reaction that you've received. I'm sure there have been a number of people that have loved it and, have said you're, shining a spotlight, as you use the term, on something that they've experienced,
Exactly.
all their lives or what have you. But I'm sure there's some people that didn't quite see it that way too.
I was bracing myself when this book released 3 months ago. I was told to expect vicious trolling, and so I had no idea what to expect, really. I have been astounded by the reception. I have received almost no negative feedback, and I'm nervous to even say that in
Wow,
case
that's
that will
amazing.
motivate people to try to change that. I have been absolutely overwhelmed by positive responses, especially among evangelicals themselves. So I think I've received more than 200 letters so far. I get them every day from white evangelicals themselves, women and men, who tell me, this is the story of my life, and thank you for writing this.
Wow.
I mean, the common motif is, as one man put it, I bumped up against so many of these trees, but I never saw the forest, right? I never saw how this all fit together. And so many evangelicals themselves who participated in this culture, who listened to James Dobson, who bought these books, who did these Bible studies, right? They never understood, right, kind of the whole picture and what they were in fact participating in and complicit in. And now they're able to see that much more clearly. And when you can see it more clearly, you can reject it, I think, more clearly.
Do you think that, like, having an academic background and the way you portrayed the material had an impact on that, kind of reception?
Absolutely, it did, because the subtitle is it's rather harsh. One review called it an urgent and sharp-elbowed book, and I really like that. Right, there is an urgency, and it is there's a harsh critique at the heart of this book, but it is absolutely a work of history. 300 pages of history, and every claim has a footnote with evidence. And I've seen a number of conservative white evangelical men talk about this book on Twitter and say, I'm checking up her footnotes, and she's actually fair. She's really fair in how she's talking about these guys, right? I had no idea Billy Graham said these things. I had no idea John Piper did this, right? And then they can check my sources and see, actually, yes, this is exactly what they said and what they did. So I think as a scholar, and particularly as a historian, right, it's just very evidence-based. And I'm just telling this story. But it's a story of popular culture, right? I'm a cultural historian. So I talk about ordinary evangelicals, the products they consumed. And I think that's why it's connecting so deeply with so many evangelicals, because there's pastors in here, there's theologians in this story, but there's a lot of just, the resources that have shaped the faith formation of ordinary evangelicals. And so everybody who reads this connects to it, I think, if they were an evangelical, if they are an evangelical, in a really kind of deeply personal way.
Wow. That's just amazing. You really struck a chord, didn't you?
Yeah. It seems to be, again, I'm still shocked by the response, particularly within the evangelical community.
So before we start talking about the election, where do you go next? With a follow-on to the book, or what do you have in mind?
Yes, it's not fully public yet, but I am going to be kind of looking at the flip side, a cultural history of white Christian womanhood.
Okay.
Yeah, it's fun. I've already started. I've got fabulous sources, 2 wonderful research assistants who know the culture very well, and we're having a lot of fun doing this research. And frankly, it's a breath of fresh air for me. Not that there won't be a critical element, but I needed a break from looking at militant masculinity.
Sure. So do you have a time frame yet?
It will depend on a couple of things, probably 2 years from now.
Okay, yeah.
It takes a while to research these books, write the books, and then there's the production. So 2 years till I can finish it, and then it's on to the publisher. So
Okay, good. Well, we'll look forward to doing a book launch interview with you when the time comes. So we do have an election coming up, and the country's about as polarized as I've ever seen it. What is your view of the overall state of our country?
It's terrible right now, right? It is. I can speak as an observer of, religion and politics, and I can just speak as a U.S. historian. I think that right now my deepest concern is about the resiliency of American democracy, right? And I'm not alone in that. Just the basic integrity of our democratic system is in jeopardy right now. Between access to voting, the president casting doubt on the results of the election, refusing to agree to step down from power, to a peaceful transition of power. All of these things are grave threats to American democracy. And so I think we need to say that and say that clearly right now. The polarization too, we have an utter lack of trust right now across the partisan divide. Such polarization, people are getting their news from completely different sources. So you take something like the coronavirus, and people on the right have a very different perception of threats of the virus and what ought to be done than people on the left, and each side doesn't trust the other's sources. And that's really, part of the story of Jesus and John Wayne. The second part of the subtitle is The Fractured a Nation. And what I came to understand is, for this kind of critical demographic of white evangelicals who play an outsized role in the Republican Party, they have for generations embraced a kind of militancy that requires an us versus them mentality, and that perpetuates this us versus them mentality. And it is linked up with this militant Christian manhood. Every man needs a battle to fight. God made him that way. Well, if you need to fight a battle, you need to find an enemy, right? And so this really works against any conception of the common good. The idea of love your neighbor as yourself, love your enemies, turn the other cheek, right? All of that gets set aside, like quite explicitly rejected. And so that's the first part of the subtitle, the corrupted of faith. And you put those together, and I do actually think that white evangelicals, they've not done this alone, but they have played a pretty central role in creating this fractured nation and this religious and cultural and political polarization.
So, not to jump to the chase, but what do we do about it?
So this is where I'm no longer an expert and I become an amateur, right? Ask me about the past and I can speak with some authority. I get nervous talking about, what we should do at this point. Vote, defend our democracy, But that's not enough. I think that within white evangelical circles, it's absolutely critical right now for people to speak the truth. And particularly, I observed this while researching the book, but I've really observed this in talking with these dozens and dozens of people who are writing to me and calling me, having read this book. Evangelicals themselves who say, you got this exactly right. And I sensed something was wrong, but couldn't quite put my finger on it until now. But I haven't felt like I could say anything. So many pastors think that they're going to lose their jobs, lose their churches if they speak out. I've heard from so many people within powerful evangelical organizations, often high up in these organizations, saying that they cannot speak out or they will lose their donors. So many people have asked me, I teach at a Christian university, asked me, are you going to be losing your job over this? I don't think so. I have the protection of academic freedom, which only goes so far, but it's something. And I have sensed no pushback from my university, to be clear. But there's this sense of threat. There's a sense within the evangelical community that if you speak out, you are going to be punished. And personal relationships are going to be frayed, right? Churches are going to be split. And so what can be done right now, honestly, I think we need everybody to speak truthfully and boldly into this moment, wherever they find themselves. And I think if we start doing that, and if more of us start doing that, then it will become clear that there are many more evangelicals themselves who are deeply troubled by what is happening and feel that they're alone or feel that they cannot speak out.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, what have you found to be most successful when you're in a situation where you're basically speaking with people that have got dramatically different views than you do?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's honestly, there's not a lot that can happen through a conversation, in my experience, through a one-off conversation. Because people are just approaching the evidence in such different ways. You would like to think that, let's talk about what the Bible says, but people bring just extremely different lenses to the scriptures, what Bible verses that they pick out and which ones they reject. So I have been quite discouraged in terms of, let's just talk and work this out. Again, I have a certain bias because I'm a historian, but I really do believe that one of the things that history can do for us is just show how we got to this point. First of all, show that things haven't always been this way, that conservative Protestants haven't always embraced Christian nationalism, that they haven't always embraced a particular militancy or militant conception of masculinity. These things were created over time in response to particular historical situations and by people, mostly men, who had something to gain personally in terms of their own power, sometimes their own wealth, in doing so. And I think, honestly, just showing how we got to this point is incredibly important, because then it can free people from thinking, that this is just the way things have always been, and therefore the way God made things to be, right? If we show that this is historically made, then we can ask ourselves, is this what we want? Is this a faithful response? Or do we need to take some of these pieces apart and try something different? And so in the book, I have the luxury of 300 pages to make this case, right? In a quick conversation, you don't have that. I don't have that. And so it becomes much more difficult. There, I think that, interpersonally, just speaking your truth. It doesn't have to be aggressively. It doesn't have to be, aimed at anyone. But within conservative evangelical circles, there has been, in many cases, a real demonization of people outside the fold, of Democrats, of feminists, of liberals. And so if you can identify as one, or just as an opponent of our current president or certain policies, and if they know you as a person, right, that is going to disrupt this demonization, right? Personal relationships always disrupt this kind of othering or, kind of fear mongering. And so that's why it's just important that you work within those relationships and just make clear that you, in all of your wholeness and goodness, have reached a different conclusion. And I think that's worth more than people realize. It's worth a lot more than posting screeds on social media.
Well, I mean, I agree with what you're saying, Kristin, and then, throughout these kinds of interviews, this is the conclusion I'm reaching too, that so much boils down to trust. And,
Yes.
That's kind of a grassroots kind of a thing.
It is.
It's good news and bad news, right? I mean, bad news, and it's not very scalable, right? And it takes a long time to make that kind of change.
It does.
And so I'm concerned about that, but I don't see any other way around it. I mean, there's a trust that's been breached that has to somehow be reestablished, so people don't continue to accelerate the us versus them.
Exactly.
And think in terms of common good, which that's been terribly hurt.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to focus a little bit of a different type of divide, which is racial divide. We've focused a lot on political divide. We've got some serious racial divides, not completely unrelated, obviously. But what are your thoughts on, regardless of how this election turns out, where we can go to help solve, systemic racism and, heal that divide?
Mm-hmm. Oh, so systemic racism, you think of tackling it in terms of structures, in terms of policies. And, I think there are certainly many policies that could be pursued in terms of, law enforcement and criminal justice reform and really just income inequality, which would benefit all Americans and need not be framed in terms of race necessarily, but because of the inequities, the structural systemic inequities that many African Americans have endured, would also help to rectify that. So there are many of these policies that can be pursued, but here too, it also entails kind of changing hearts, if you will, which is a really evangelical thing to say, right? That the heart has to be transformed. But what we're seeing right now is this kind of shocking, maybe it shouldn't be shocking, but data coming out that we've seen just in the last year, a huge drop in the number of white evangelicals who actually think that we should work towards racial justice, racial reconciliation, that has declined significantly in the last year. And so, here too, we have to understand what racism is and what it looks like. And it's been, and there are many people who want to work against this, right? And so now racial justice, social justice, has become demonized in many conservative circles. Critical race theory has now become a sign of all that's bad and evil and Marxism, instead of really just thinking about biblical calls to love and justice and unity. And so in the book itself too, I am writing about white evangelicals. And I've seen a couple of people suggest that I might be racist because I'm naming white evangelicals as white instead of just being colorblind, right? But as a historian, right, that just makes no sense because white evangelicals are largely a distinctive tradition in and of themselves, a distinctive cultural movement, if you will. And their religion and their politics and their cultural identity just looks so different from Black Protestantism, for example, which is a much more prophetic tradition. Black Protestants don't adhere to Christian nationalism, right? That declension narrative makes no sense. So there are these profound differences. But the thing is, many white evangelicals don't often talk about race. It's very implicit in their identity, so they don't have a concept that the very values that they are at the center of their identity, America is a Christian nation. It was founded as Christian, and then things went terrible in the 1960s. That makes utterly no sense to any Black American, right? And yet you can talk about Christian America and never mention race. And so for many white evangelicals, it does not see, they are unaware of how much their racial identity as white Christians has shaped their values. And so again, history can kind of show what this looks like. Otherwise, if you just try to have the conversation, you're going to very quickly run up against offending them because they don't personally feel racial animosity to the Black person that they know at work, or, you know, who comes in their church, or, you know, the African immigrant that they are helping to support, or, and so you have to, you know, I think history can do a lot to show us what we're actually talking about. You don't need critical race theory. You don't need any theory. You just need to look at the stories, look at our own past, and listen to the experiences of people who are different from us. And so I do think that policies are necessary, but we have to come to a different understanding, again, at the grassroots on an individual basis, which is hard.
So Kristin, that sounds like another potentially great book.
Oh no, there are other authors, right, who are doing amazing work in this area right now. So Jamar Tisby is one.
Yeah.
Dante Stewart is going to have a book come out next year that is going to be fabulous. Esau McCauley, Willie Jennings. There's already some just fabulous resources out there.
Good. So I think it'd be great for us to follow up, you know, in a few months after the election and talk about, you know, kind of healing and where things are then. But for now, what do you see as the most important outcome of this election?
The outcome I would like to see, it seems very like a very low bar. I mean, you told me a year or two ago that this was going to be, you know, what I really hope for in this election, I would be terrified. The low bar outcome that is the most important, I think, for us right now is that our democracy survives, and that enough social and political trust survives past November. And that is essential. We can disagree about policies. We can disagree about partisanship. We can disagree about a lot of things. That's the nature of a democracy. But we need a functioning democracy to provide safe structures and fair structures within which we can have those disagreements. So that is the main thing that I'm hoping for right now. And then I have a long wish list of other things I would like, none of which seem very likely at the moment. But that's really what I'm holding on to right now. And that's what I'm working for. And, you know, in every way that I can.
Couldn't agree with you more, Kristin. Well, thanks so much for joining us. It's really great to have this conversation with you. I'm glad that we were able to get this, you know, scheduled and make it happen. So thank you so much for taking time in your busy schedule to do this.
Oh, thank you as well. It's great to be here with you.